Brogan and welcome to the Allianz Water Expert podcast. At Allianz, we're committed to raising awareness about global water challenges and supporting positive change through education, innovation and collaboration. Today, we're joined by Dr. Xavier Leflaive, Principal Administrator in the OECD Environment Directorate. Welcome, Xavier.
Nice talking to you, Michelle. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Can you please explain what your role is?
Yeah, sure. So the OECD is what we call an intergovernmental organization, meaning that we work with and for governments. Our motto is better policies for better lives. So really the ambition of the OECD and the rationale for all our work is to inform governments so that they can improve policies in a wide range of issues. The distinctive feature of the OECD is that we are an economic-based organization, meaning that we approach every topic that the government covers from that economic angle. So we started working on water. We resumed working on water maybe like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when governments realized that water was actually an economic issue. It's of course an environmental and social issue, but there is a very strong economic dimension in water crisis and economic opportunities related to water. So in the Environment Directorate, typically we liaise and engage on a very regular basis with ministers and ministries of environment in OECD member countries and beyond. The governments decide about our program of work and the allocation of our resources. They set the priorities and we try to satisfy their demands. So typically they will ask for advice on how to address droughts or wildfires or air pollution in specific context, and that's where we do our analysis to inform them.
Okay. You claim that droughts and floods are local episodes of a larger phenomenon. What do you mean by that?
Well, obviously there has always been floods and droughts. They're part of normal life. The thing that we are now experiencing, and this is well documented, a shift in the patterns of droughts and floods. So typically episodes of water scarcity or floods that used to happen every 100 years are now happening every 10 years. And droughts, severe droughts that used to happen every 10 years, they are now happening every year also. So obviously there is a shift in the pattern of droughts and floods. And the reason why, and that's really interesting, that it's the first time in human history that we have actually changed the source of water on land, which is rainfall. So through a combination of various drivers, we are tilting the hydrological cycle through which water will fall on land and run off through our rivers, lakes, and aquifers. So that's really a change, and that explains why these episodes of droughts and floods are now becoming much more severe, much more extreme, much more frequent, because the historical or traditional patterns we were used to are being tilted.
Okay. Who is affected and how are they affected by this?
Well, frankly, every community on Earth is affected potentially. Every economy and industry is affected. Obviously, agriculture, which is the largest water user globally, is particularly affected. If you think about it, 50% of the food that is grown globally, or 1/4 of the cereal that is being produced globally, is currently being grown on areas where there will be less water available for agriculture in the future. So that puts a very high level of pressure on food security that will definitely affect food markets globally and the prices of foodstuff in various communities and various countries. So only if you, and that's only for food and agriculture. but every industry is potentially affected. One that I find is really interesting is microchips. People don't usually know that microchip manufacturing is actually requires a lot of water. And that manufacturing capacity is currently concentrated in Taiwan. Taiwan is facing a very severe drought, which is affecting its capacity to manufacture these microchips. And these have knock-on effects through a number of value chains. So typically, cell phone manufacturers, car manufacturers now are facing delays because they can't purchase, the microchip they need. And the reason for that is actually a drought in Taiwan. So I think that's a very interesting illustration of how a drought in one part of the world has global consequences through value chains, trade flows, because we are living in a global economic context. So I think it's fair to say that no country, no city, and no industry is, properly shielded from risks of water scarcity or too much water.
Yeah. No, I can understand that. Like we've seen that with the disruption to the supply chain during COVID when factories weren't able to produce, how that knock-on impact, affected everyone. You couldn't get the goods that you needed. Can you specify how that relates to climate change specifically?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Michelle, because there are actually two sides of that coin. On the one hand, we understand that climate change with hotter temperature contributes to accelerating evapotranspiration, meaning that the moisture in soils will evaporate more rapidly and will be transferred as vapor in the atmosphere. You can show actually, there is evidence that one additional degree of global warming translates in 7% more moisture or vapor in the air, if you like, meaning that it's less moisture in soil. So somehow climate change is contributing to drying soils. The thing is that there is another side to that coin, because drier soils are less able to capture and store carbon. But every scenario on climate mitigation assume that maybe 25% of greenhouse gases being emitted will be captured and stored in soils. But drier soils will be less able to capture and store carbon, meaning that if, on the one hand, the hydrological cycle is a victim of climate change, on the other hand, it has become a compounding factor, again, because drier soils will be less able to capture carbon, meaning that drier soils will actually accelerate or amplify climate change. So I think that interface between climate change and the hydrological cycle need to be better understood by governments, corporates, or lay people, because this is a very critical one. The way forward, if I may jump on this, is to actually try to keep moisture in soil. If we manage to keep moisture in soil, and there are many ways that can be done, that can contribute to stabilizing the hydrological cycle. So trying to avoid the magnification of droughts and floods, but it can also contribute to mitigating climate change. So keeping moisture in soils have a number of co-benefits from a climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and hydrological cycle perspective.
Why are we losing moisture out of soil? I don't understand why that's happening. We need to keep more moisture in the soil, but
Yes.
Is it the extreme weather conditions that's taking the moisture out of the soil? Is that what the cause of the problem is?
Well, regular warming, so climate change is actually accelerating evapotranspiration, meaning that moisture that used to be captured and stored in soils will now evaporate and shift as vapor to the atmosphere. So that accelerates the hydrological cycle. This contributes to this new pattern of droughts and floods that I illustrated earlier. And so if we want to stabilize the hydrological cycle, it is critical to try to keep moisture in soil so that there will be less vapor in the atmosphere, which at some point will fall as harder rains, storms, with the devastating consequences we all experience. And also, when we keep moisture in soils, we increase the capacity of soils to capture and store carbon. So there are co-benefits from both a hydrological cycle and a carbon sequestration or climate mitigation perspective. Does that make sense?
Okay. Could you expand on how land use changes such as urbanization or deforestation contribute to the disruption of the hydrological cycle?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually, which follows the discussion we just had. If we're serious about keeping moisture in soils, the best technology, the best option to keep moisture in soils is through ecosystems. Wetlands, forests, they play a very critical role in keeping moisture in soils, meaning that they play a very critical role in stabilizing this hydrological cycle and at the same time mitigating climate change. So that's part of this is part of the answer. When we change land use, so typically when we deforest and we substitute forests by an urban area or more farmland, we will actually accelerate evapotranspiration because we will lose the shades and all the functions that forests provide us with. And that has the similar effect as climate change, which will accelerate evapotranspiration, meaning that moisture that used to be kept in soils will now then evaporate and will be transferred in the atmosphere as vapor, translating further downwind into harder rains, more storms, and these potentially catastrophic episodes. So that's why land use is critical. If we keep our forests, if we keep our ecosystems, and if we keep our wetlands, we keep actually moisture in soils with the co-benefits already mentioned. This is why the way we build our cities is really critical. If we keep building cities as impervious surfaces, we actually accelerate or amplify the unbalance of the hydrological cycle that I already referred to. If we build our cities, with permeable surfaces, more green spaces, green roofs that can actually capture rainfall and keep it on that land, we can actually contribute to stabilizing the hydrological cycle with, again, the same co-benefits in terms of climate mitigation.
That totally makes sense. What are the economic risks if we fail to manage water-related impacts from climate change and land use change?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the economic impacts of failing to manage water-related risks or the water-related impacts of climate change will be very significant. Obviously, food production will be affected. Almost every value chain you can think about globally will be affected. I can't think of any significant industry that is not, using water. If you think about textile and garment, mining, energy generation requires a lot of water. Microchips and all the other industry that use that kind of, parts, they will be all affected. And if you consider that water risks can actually generate systemic risks. In the end, financial institutions will be affected because the way they manage their portfolio, the way money is being invested will be at risk, meaning that even the financial sector will be affected by the economic consequences of water-related risks. This is why actually you can see around the world an increasing number of central banks, like the European central banks, but there are others, who are now taking water-related risks seriously because they can see that water-related risks can have an impact on financial stability. They can have an impact on price stability and inflation. So this is really becoming a macroeconomic issue, and even financial regulators now are starting to consider that and figure out how to deal with it.
What can be done about it by governments or by regular households?
So there is a wide range of policies, regulations, nudges that governments can mobilize to address water-related risks. One thing I would like to emphasize is that, as you said earlier, so these policies obviously will deal with water as such. So water policies, water allocation mechanisms, regulation to avoid wastage of water or to incentivize water use efficiency have a role to play. But other policies which may not be directly related to water also matter. Think about land use. Think about urban policies and the way we build and renew our cities. As we discussed earlier, they will have an impact on the hydrological cycle. So it's actually critical today to make these departments in charge of land use change, in charge of agriculture or urban policies, realize that their decisions will have an impact on the hydrological cycle and therefore an impact on droughts and floods. So I think a real challenge we're facing here is to put water on the agenda of a number of policy communities which decision will have an impact on water resources and the hydrological cycle. They may not be aware of that, but they are critical stakeholders, and they can really contribute to the solution.
What are nature-based solutions, and how can they help communities adapt to the impacts of climate change on water systems?
Nature-based solutions are parts of that portfolio of policies or action program that governments can put in place. They are typically engineered solutions, but based on natural dynamics, natural processes, or ecosystems. So typically, restoring a wetland is considered a nature-based solution. It's nature-based, and it's part of the solution to a problem which is climate change mitigation or a tilted hydrological cycle. So when we protect our wetlands, that's contributing to a nature-based solution. Another illustration I can provide you with, since you work in the health domain. Water utilities will capture water that will be treated and then supplied to households for domestic users. So the water we drink is actually captured upstream by water utilities, treated and supplied to our homes as a safe and reliable resource. When that water is polluted because of agriculture practices that generate nitrates, runoff, etc., that comes at an additional cost for treatment for the utilities, which will affect us as households because we have to, the utility will have to generate the revenue to compensate that cost. A number of water utilities globally are now engaging with farmers which are active in the catchment areas where the water that the utilities will use is being captured, and they're trying to help these farmers shift to more natural, environment-friendly farming practices. There are again a number of co-benefits. The co-benefit for the utility is that if farmers shift towards more environmental friendly practices, that will minimize the cost to treat the pollution from that water. So somehow by helping these farmers to transition towards more greener, more environmental friendly practices, they contribute to a nature-based solution, because that comes as a substitute to additional treatment, which will be technology driven, energy intensive, and which will generate more harmful consequences on the environment. So protecting catchment areas through helping farmers to shift to greener farming practices can be considered as a nature-based solution. It alleviates, it minimizes the risks of water pollution. It can be done in a very cost-effective way. It can be less costly than additional treatment. It is less energy intensive, and it contributes to a number of co-benefits from an environmental and health perspective.
What examples have you seen of governments taking action to restore or rebalance the hydrological cycle?
Well, this focus on the hydrological cycle is fairly new, I must say, because again, all water policies, most water policies, institutions, and water-related infrastructure, if you think about it, they focus on water after it has fallen on land. Very few policies are actually designed to ensure that the cycle, the hydrological cycle itself, will be stable. So, to me, the potential, the new perspective here, which is gaining traction, is what policies can be put in place to keep moisture in soil, because that will be a condition to stabilize the hydrological cycle. And that's where you see initiative to support, for instance, what is called regenerative agriculture or agroforestry, when you combine agriculture, farming practices with conservation of forests and ecosystems. This is one area where governments are starting to take action, which can really generate a number of co-benefits, enhancing the resilience of farming practices and agriculture and food production, but at the same time, stabilizing the hydrological cycle. So this, in my opinion, seems to be a very fruitful, avenue to be considered and probably scaled up.
Is there any particular country that's kind of leading in this space that other countries could look to?
But it's difficult to single out one country which would do everything right. One role we have at the OECD is to identify good practices internationally and try to promote them as, an inspiration for other countries to replicate and scale up. And actually, you can find very inspiring, policy instruments in very diverse set of contexts. In Europe, of course, but also US, China is doing very interesting things on a number of these issues, typically around land use change. But good practices don't necessarily emerge from OECD or large developed countries. They can also emerge from developing countries. We actually learn the value of traditional practices that are promoted by indigenous people. They have proven to be very resilient, and we now better understand their values and how they can actually inspire new policies, new practices in different parts of the world. So instead of focusing on one particular country, one thing we're trying to do is to identify some of these, good practices, analyze them, characterize what are the requisites to replicate and scale them up, and try to propose them as a source of inspiration to other countries. That's the benefit of, these global fora or international conferences. Sometimes people wonder what's the point. Well, part of the benefit of these conferences is that they provide an opportunity for countries to learn from one another, to see what is working in one particular country and how that can inspire new effective policies in another country. And that's really where I think the OECD is good at. That's what we are trying to do.
Okay, very good. In your work at the OECD, how do you support countries in building resilience against extreme water events like droughts and floods?
Well, that work that I just mentioned about trying to identify good practices, trying to specify why they are robust, why they could inspire other countries. I think this is one way we are helping. Because the OECD is an economic organization, we also put a lot of efforts into providing economic analysis, signaling the costs of doing things wrong and the benefits of doing things right, so that we can really promote cost-effective policies. So making a strong economic case for policy reform is part of the things we do, and I think that we hope that can really help countries move in the right direction, because they will have more robust information on the benefit of shifting towards more effective policies. And that's an area where economic analysis can really add value, and that's a distinctive capacity of the OECD.
Okay. How can water infrastructure like dams, levees, or irrigation systems be adapted to remain effective under future climate scenarios?
Well, that's a very interesting domain, because obviously these infrastructure are long-lived. So typically we now have in place a number of dams, reservoirs, dikes, which were designed 2, 3, 4, 5 decades ago, before we had a robust understanding of climate change and how it will affect the way these infrastructure will deliver. And actually, there is a risk that a number of these infrastructure become stranded assets. If you travel around the world, you will see a number of reservoirs which are actually dry, which are empty. They were meant to provide, to enhance resilience against water scarcity risks, but when a reservoir is empty, it is obviously useless. So obviously we can change the way we design this infrastructure. A country here that is really interesting is the Netherlands, because as you probably know, a large part of the country, and 60% I think of GDP in the Netherlands is actually situated below sea level, the way the country is being built. And so the Dutch, they have a very unique expertise in shielding or mitigating flood risks, typically from sea level rise and floods from the sea. And they used to rely on very heavy infrastructure, very sophisticated dikes, etc. But at some point they realized that these dikes can only go to a certain height. At some point it becomes very, very expensive to build higher dikes to protect against sea level rise or river floods. So they are now changing their approach. So of course they still build some of these hard grey infrastructure, but they increasingly rely on natural-based solutions. So actually there is actually a very interesting program to protect against floods from rivers, which is called Room for the River. And the idea is to do exactly the opposite of what used to be done. So the traditional response to flood risks from rivers is to build dikes, channel the river, and make sure that water will not escape and will be chased away faster toward the sea. The Room for the River program does the exact opposite. And somehow it's a way to acknowledge that at some point, some floodplains will be flooded, and that's actually how things should be done. And the idea is to avoid, building very valuable assets in these floodplains, compensate farmers or property owners when they will be flooded, but accept that these areas of the land will be flooded occasionally. And we see that as a very interesting shift in perspective. Instead of relying on hard concrete infrastructure, trying to play with the river. I mean, play is not the right word because this is a very serious matter, but to engage with the river, with the natural dynamics of the river flow, and that can provide very resilient and cost-effective response to flood risks.
Yeah, I guess if we hadn't built so much on these lands, if they hadn't got these properties, that natural evolution would be able to happen. So I guess, we're kind of getting in the way of ourselves in some cases. Like in Ireland, we get lots of rain, but we don't collect all of it. But then we might get a period, if we're lucky, of a few weeks sunshine, and then suddenly we start running out of water. So I guess in countries that get a lot of rain, we should be collecting more water to make up for the countries that aren't getting it. Would that
That
help with the balance, or?
that certainly makes sense, Michelle. Still, I would like to signal that sometimes infrastructure can give a false or misleading sense of resilience or security. We've seen that around the world. As I mentioned, you are in a country where you are facing water scarcity risks. You build a reservoir. When that reservoir is full, you feel safe. But at some point, because of climate change, because of shifts in the hydrological cycle, it may happen that that reservoir will be empty. And so you have no plan B.
For sure. Let's leave it there for today, but thank you so much for coming on to the podcast.